I've been chosen to lead this conversation, so I'm just going to be guiding it as well as adding my commentary with the rest of these wonderful people. So the first question I wanted to answer with is something that she mentioned, the refugee crisis that has been produced from this war. Millions of people have been displaced internally and externally as they flee to nations like Moldova, Romania, Poland, and across Europe. And so I wanted to ask both of you, what type of challenges do these Ukrainian refugees face as they flee their homes?
Well, they're traveling into unknown circumstances. You know, a lot of the people they're not rich, they don't have as much money, you know, as they would like to. They don't know where they're going, and they're leaving everything behind in order for safety. So they're trading their life, everything they've ever known for their whole life in order just to be safe from the war. So it's the unknown that's really good.
From my perspective, people really face many obstacles because, first of all, to become a refugee is not something that you can generally get prepared for. It's not the immigration in the usual sense of this word, because once you make a decision to do so, you probably prepare, you save some money, you learn about the culture, you learn the language, whatever. And as it was correctly said, this is a huge stress. It's a challenge. Lots of people don't know where to go. They don't know how to build their life from the scratch. And I think that there are several phases, because the first one is when you're basically struggling for your life and your first thought is how to stay alive, right? But once you pass this stage, there is another question, how exactly you have to live after that. And that causes more challenges, because even if prior to that you had a clear understanding of what your destination in life is, it does not mean that it would not be lost. Plus, there are different limitations, there are different understanding of how refugees are being treated, and generally whether it is correctly to label people as refugees, meaning that a refugee is technically, in terms of legislation, is a person who gave up their citizenship for temporary documents that allow to stay in a certain country for a certain period of time. And those people who leave, who flee, most of them are people who are under temporary protection status, and I think that we have to label it as such.
So I talked to a lot of aid organizations in Poland before I went into Ukraine, and there's two stories I would talk about in relation to this. The first story I would like to talk about has to do with the psychological damage of young children. So I talked to the headmaster of a school in Poland that has accepted refugees in Lublin. Wonderful woman, it was a great conversation. But we went out to watch the children play and talk about the different challenges they face, and Lublin is near an airport. And I was talking to her about, you know, the differences between the Polish children and the Ukrainian children, because there's a lot of history between Poland and Ukraine and a lot of violence that has occurred between those two countries, so I wanted to see if there was any strife. And she says, they're children. They play together, they're fun, they just want to play tag. But she says there's one way you can tell the difference between a Ukrainian child at this facility and a Polish child. And the way you can tell that difference is when a plane flies over. When a plane flies over the school, the Polish children just keep playing. It's normal. It is what it is. We're near an airport here in Miami. It's normal for that type of stuff for airports to be in a modern country. For the Ukrainian children, they lay down on the ground. They duck and cover at the sound of those planes. They have been changed. You cannot take away that psychological damage without extensive psychological work, and a lot of it will be there for their whole lives. And so I'd like to emphasize that we talk about beds and food and stuff like that, but a lot of the unseen scars of war affecting young children need to be addressed through therapy and getting sure that these children get the psychological help that they need, either through NGOs or charity organizations or actions from governments. And the other story I'd like to tell is I was talking to a woman who was coordinating the refugee response in Lublin, and she told me that she has had conversations with refugees who are thinking about coming to Poland and fleeing their country, who have had untold things done to them by Russian soldiers when it comes to sexual abuse. I won't get into too much detail. And they are scared due to certain things that they have heard from the media, that if they go to certain countries in the West, that they won't be able to get the reproductive health care that they want to make sure they deal with the impact of that violation to themselves. And so those are two issues that I'd like to highlight that are not regularly highlighted in the media. The next question I'd like to bring to our attention is when we look at what happened in Afghanistan, that is a project the United States worked on for 20 years, trying to build up that country. And it feels like it collapsed in an instant. And so a lot of us were accustomed to that when it comes to our allies in the world. And so a lot of us, assumed for various reasons that Ukraine was going to collapse in a similar manner. I mean, it was going against the second most powerful military in the world, allegedly. Why do you think Ukraine was able to hold out on a war that was only supposed to last 3 days, according to Russian generals?
Well, these people, the Ukrainians are fighting for their land. They're fighting for their families, their history, their culture. So these are all things that are deeply rooted. And, would any one of us give up that so easily? And the answer is no. We wouldn't let that happen, regardless of who is trying to do that to us. So their spirit is incredibly high for this, and their will to fight is, who's going to beat that when it's on their land?
I would add some more, let's say, practical things on that. So obviously, I do believe that Ukrainians have a great spirit. I've never felt more than people in my country are more united than right now. We have to also understand that during centuries, most of the generations of Ukrainians were suffering from attacks from Russia, Russian Empire, whatsoever we call it. But at the same time, I think that the ability to stand as we do right now is also due to many thanks to our foreign partners and to weapons that we get supplied, because right now this is the issue of Ukraine. At least some media, especially Western media, label it as such, but at the same time we cannot know what can happen in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, in Baltic countries, in Poland, and whether it would go further. So by defending our land and our territories, Ukraine is also fighting for some other countries.
I'm going to do something that I think you guys will appreciate. I'm going to bash an intelligence agency. So I think part of this was the failure of American intelligence agencies and other intelligence agencies throughout Europe when predicting how Ukraine was going to perform against Russia. So the American intelligence agency predicted almost to the dot when this was going to happen. In fact, the Russians had to scramble to change their plans because Joe Biden came out publicly and said they're going to invade tomorrow. And they didn't know how the United States knew this. But it was because we have a lot of technical intelligence, satellites, hacking of communications. And the Chechens, well, they like to use, I guess, Discord more than they like to use encrypted communications. And so that was the reason why we were so accurate in predicting the invasion. But what we don't have a lot of, or at least enough of, when it comes to the Russian government, is human intelligence. Having people in army divisions trying to hey, what's the willpower here to fight? What's the corruption like when it comes to 1.5 million winter uniforms just disappearing out of nowhere? That was the failure of the American intelligence agencies in predicting that Ukraine was going to collapse so quickly, and why the American government was offering Zelensky a ride out of the country. And Zelensky, of course, responded, and now what has become a famous quote, "I don't need ride, I need ammunition." And so I would say that that's the first thing. I wanted to bash an intelligence agency, which I think you guys will appreciate. But I think the next thing I'd like to talk about is that Ukraine has strived for independence for hundreds of years. Voltaire wrote about it a very, very long time ago. I mean, this is I think for a lot of Westerners, this is becoming, the first time they've ever heard about it. But for Ukrainians, this is a decades, generations old struggle. And so for them, this is like their War of 1812 for them. This is the empire coming back, trying to reclaim what they say was stolen from them and what belongs to them. It's a war of colonialism. And so Ukrainians have a lot of will to protect that. Not to mention the revolution that was the Euromaidan helped birth a new age of democracy in Ukraine that I think a lot of people want to protect. I talked to a lot of these Euromaidan protesters who remember how protesters were targeted during the Euromaidan protest movement. They remember how Yanukovych tried to ban protesting during the protest movement. They remember how paid thugs were used to brutalize them, and they don't want the occupation the brutality they saw in Bucha with the mass graves, or the largest mass grave that was just uncovered in Izium, to come to their village. And I think that's a big motivator for them. The next question I wanted to ask is, media covers this war, CNN, MSNBC, and they give everybody a certain narrative that you're supposed to believe depending upon whatever analyst they bring on.
Yeah.
And so we've all been on the ground in Ukraine to some capacity. What is different from what you've seen on the ground to how the media covers it or some of the narratives you heard online?
Tanya, you want to start that? Oh,
Yeah, sure. So first of all, it all depends on the media, who owns the media, and whether we generally can call any media independent, even if they claim to be as such. Then second thing is that I usually pay attention at how media is put in the headlines. For example, recently there were some articles from BBC that was named as conflict in Ukraine, Ukrainian issue. So media is basically avoiding to call the things by their names. We have to see it as war, as a full-scale invasion of the sovereign country. This is the first thing. Second thing is that it is about the numbers, because obviously it's really hard to count right now how many victims of the war there are in the country. But I keep on checking the information about Mariupol, because this is the city of my origin. And the statistics that was given about the city is that there were approximately 400, 500,000 of people killed, though the information that is provided by local resources is approximately 8,700,000 of people. And I think that this is not the total number, because Mariupol is still under occupation, and it is impossible to find out and discover how many mass graves there are, how many places where people were buried in the yards there are. And generally, I think that it is a very different approach when you watch the war from the side, when you are not in the country, when you are not on the ground. Because basically, even if you're extremely empathetic, even if you follow the global agenda, it is just impossible to live through the same things as people do on the daily basis. Whether they're afraid of the air raid alerts or they don't pay attention, because unfortunately, you also get used to live in war. And war is not only about the death. War is, life as well. A certain way of life. And it is also about the way how generally people react, how they react to challenge, how they react to each other, to people from different parts of the country, and as well as how much people stay united. A couple of days ago, they were collecting money from one of the biggest foundations in Ukraine for the drones after the mass shelling that was on Monday. And they collected $352 million just per one day.
One of the big narratives that I was told about beforehand was the difference between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers. In fact, it is the fight that has really defined this war when you look at how media talks about it. And so I went to the places in the war where there are majority Russian speakers. I went to the Donbass, I went to the city of Kramatorsk, I went to Kharkiv, I went to Zaporozhye, I went to these locations that are majority Russian speakers. And I talked to the locals and I talked to the soldiers as well fighting it. And I went to SPG-9 training with the Ukrainian military out there. And I just listened to them talk. I don't know a lot of Russian, I don't know a lot of Ukrainian, you know, Dobro day, yakti, the most basic of stuff. And I noticed that every single soldier that I spoke to spoke Russian. Every single one. All of them communication in Russian. They didn't say tak. They didn't say Ukrainian words. They were speaking in Russian. And from this perspective I was given by Western media and Russian media as well was this idea of like the Ukrainian speaker versus the Russian speaker is how it's talked about. But all the soldiers I met were speaking Russian. And when I talked to them, if they were a translator, what they expressed to me is our part of the country is the part that's getting bombed the most. Our part of the country has had the most deaths, had the most casualties. Our part of the country has had the most violence from Russian bombs. And when you think about it in that way, that the people that the Russian government is coming to talk about liberating are the same population that's dying the most from Russian bombs, it's not that hard to reason why the Russian speakers of the area are fighting so hard against the Russian invasion. There's no liberation when your child or your mother or your brother gets killed by a Russian drone strike. That isn't any liberation I have ever heard of. The next question I wanted to talk about is, what do you hear from Ukrainians that they need the most? Because you hear a lot of different calls from a lot of different people, NGOs, Raytheon, and different groups trying to influence exactly what we send over to Ukraine. What is it that you hear the most on the ground about what they need?
They would always say, close the sky, protect the sky. Because if they could protect the bombs that are coming in, the shelling, they could win the ground war. They know their land, they know how to fight on it, and they can protect it. So they would always say, close the sky. Mm-hmm. That's what I was told.
I remember I had a conversation with one woman who even understood that the political consequences of closing the skies was mighty. She would ask for it, then she would know, I know it's so complicated, I'm not a politician. And that's why I think one of the main things I've been told, I remember I talked to a hospital director which hospital was struck by Russian missiles, and I was expecting, what do you want? And I was expecting, bandages and stuff like that. And he tells me about air defense. Air defense, why should a hospital director even know what an S-300 missile is? He should be talking to about like type of different medical equipment, and that really impacted me. What about you?
I would agree about the air raid protection, because the air defense is the thing that is crucially needed, and I can explain why. Because, for instance, Russian army is also using Iranian drones, and these are these type of drones that can change their destination. So basically, if in the beginning the decision is to shell, let's say, Lviv, on the halfway it can be changed for Kiev, and how can Ukrainian army respond in a quick way. Unfortunately, it causes lots of death. And also the example of Mariupol and the tragedy of Mariupol Dramatic Theater also shows that it is the thing that's firstly needed. But at the same time, recently I had a discussion with the head of Superhumans Ukraine Center, and this is not the only thing that is needed in Ukraine. So first of all, I think that people in Ukraine are really grateful for humanitarian aid provided of different types, but it's not like you see that someone is a refugee or even internally displaced person and you bring clothes or medications. It's all needed, of course, but at the same time, there are lots of people who lost body parts due to shelling, also people from the military as well. And right now, focus in Ukraine is also on building the rehabilitation centers. And I know that one of the biggest rehabilitation centers is going to be built in Kyiv. It's being built together with the US partners who already had experience in that. So we also need the technologies from the West. We also need some military trainings for our army. Obviously, we need some humanitarian aid, but this is never a prior thing right now.
We've all seen reports of war crimes and brutality in this war. We've all probably experienced it to some degree firsthand.
Yeah.
Is there anything you would want to say about that when it comes to the type of things you've seen, the type of actions you've seen while on the ground?
Well, talking to residents in Bucha who were living under occupation, these people were psychologically and physically tortured. They had soldiers when they occupied the city. They were coming into homes, breaking into homes, stealing stuff. They would tell men to undress on the street, looking for tattoos, signs of nationalism or, Ukrainian pride, looking for bruises on knees, which meant that you're a soldier, you got down and shot. They're raping women, children. What else? They were shooting at people trying to flee the city when they came in and occupied it. And just the shelling, the constant shelling of residential areas, civilian areas. They're purposely doing it.
There's one story I would want to tell of something I experienced, and I put the film online on Twitter if anybody wanted to go see this. I was in the area where, this is actually the same place I interviewed the person about the hospital, and I was in the city of Mykolaiv, and I was very hungry for a steak because I'm American. And so I went to a local steakhouse, and this was at the same time the Kherson counteroffensive was launched by the Ukrainian army. And I was in there with 2 Polish aid workers, and I was discussing like, oh my goodness, this is massive. I mean, this is from our direction in the city of Mykolaiv. Is there somebody we know in the area we could interview? And we're talking about it. Eventually we finish our meal, we leave the restaurant, and an artillery shell falls 300 feet away from me. And then another one 200 feet away from me over here. Another one
Lucky
behind me.
Shrapnel
Another
didn't
way
get you.
bound me. I was very lucky.
Yeah.
Other people were not. In this strike, not too far away from me, 2 people were completely eviscerated. 24 were injured. This was an area between restaurants and apartment buildings. The only soldier I saw was after the 6th or 7th strike, and he was running to try to help the people who were injured. It's impossible for me to see that just shelling of the city center of Mykolaiv in these areas between restaurants and apartment blocks, which was a civilian center during rush hours, like 3 p.m. People are coming home from work, and say that's not deliberate, because it wasn't one shell that missed. It was multiple shells, one after the other, in response to a counteroffensive being launched. And that's a constant theme I hear, that for every Russian military failure, they repay Ukraine through targeting the civilians.
Yep.
Through their own frustration, they take out that frustration on the civilian population, which happened a lot in Bucha. I've heard a lot of the same reports.
Can I talk about?
Quickly, I want to make sure we can get...
When I was in Kharkiv, you know, I was following around 4 volunteers who were delivering food and medicine to civilians who couldn't leave. We had just gotten to the building where we were staying. We were living underneath the building in the basement, and we had just pulled up. All of a sudden, rockets started coming in, and there's all residential buildings. There's nothing else, no stores. I mean, you had to drive like 10 minutes to get to a store. So it's just buildings. And I think I counted maybe 25 rockets that came in, and we were very lucky to survive that. So that's just a first-hand experience of you know, what I went through.
I think that generally world has to know more specific war crime stories, because when we come up to generalization, we don't see people behind that, we see just the numbers. I would agree that there are lots of war crimes connected with targeting civilians, which is basically a war terror. This is the breaking of Geneva Convention and etc. At the same time, these are also sexual assaults, and I think that we have to talk not only about women and children, though they're prior vulnerable social groups that suffer from that, but also men, also soldiers. Then there is the terror of soldiers, especially the case in Olenivka, where still lots of Azov defenders are, and their relatives, they have no idea what's going on, whether they are alive or not, whether they suffered from that shelling that was a month ago or not. I have specific cases that I know personally, both from my family, since they were in blockade for 3 months in Mariupol, and from the friends who managed to flee from the regions that were under the constant shelling as well. I know families who were killed. They were just living in neighborhoods and nothing helped them. Doesn't matter whether they were hiding in shelters or someone was dying while trying to carry on some medications or water to other people, because this is just how it works right now. And I think that it is crucial to document war crimes. In March, when I didn't know whether my family was alive or not, I thought that probably I could help and contribute to how this war is being led, at least at the level how I can. And I started to collect the stories of people who managed to flee. I reached out to the editors of the Medium platform, and together we recorded approximately 300 stories. Some of them became pretty viral. Some of those people who we were writing about, they got some financial help from private donors that helped them to start their life from scratch. Maybe it's not too much, but at the same time, it's still something. And, you know, I think that lots of people were brought up with this narrative, never again, and then something is just coming to your land and says, okay, we can't do it again. So that's why it is really significant to document what's going on now.
One of the main questions I've heard while here from people is the threat of a nuclear weapon being used, either in Ukraine or it's spiraling out into a full-scale nuclear war. I wanted either of you could pick this up. What do you gauge the threat is of something like that happening? And what is the reaction of people on the ground in Ukraine to the constant threat of those types of weapons being used?
I think that there are two sides of it. Let's start from the reaction of the people on the ground. As much as media is trying to inform people about the possible threat of the nuclear attack, of course, people are worried, they're frustrated, but at the same time, all anxiety and anxiety from war as well, it also has its own phases. So the first phase was denial, then it was the peak of the anxiety, and right now people are just trying to think about those safety plans, plans B, to get some water, food, and just first necessity stuff in case if something happens. Then if we talk about that in terms of how generally media and propaganda is working, I think that it also comes from both sides, because I think that everyone would agree that all wars are hybrid these days, and to impose the threat and the opportunity of the nuclear attack is one thing, but to make it work, it's the second thing. And even if the decision is made to impose the nuclear weapon, it doesn't mean that it would go through the whole mechanism, and all of those who stand behind those processes would really implement it. However, if we talk about the possibility, I don't think that it would be a full-scale nuclear attack. It can be locally, for example, it could be around the borders, it could be near Chernihiv, it could be near Kharkiv, or it could be from the side of Kherson. But however, those weapons that are applied, they have the mechanism of work so that the nuclear threat would go down just in a week. So it would not be compared, for example, to the tragedy of Chernobyl nuclear station or whatsoever.
Do you have anything to say?
Well, I think it comes down to that. I mean, we have, when we think nuclear, we're thinking major, but like they have, there's obviously nuclear weapons that are a smaller scale that they can use. But I think that's like the last resort, but I think out of desperation. So I think if Putin's realizing he's losing this war and he gets desperate because he doesn't want to go back, and he can't undo everything that's already been done for years, not just this year, but out of desperation, it will come down to that.
I've talked to a lot of analysts about this, military analysts, because I am not an expert on these weapons. But the general response I get is that the odds of something like this happening are of course low, because there's many responses that would be given to Russia. The first problem is delivering a weapon of this type has complications. First off, when you hit the button to do this type of thing, it's not that a nuke just gets launched, it's it goes down to chain of command. Right. And if one person in that chain of command, like she said earlier, says no, then you can't do it. If any single one of them says, I don't want all my family to be killed in a radiated hellfire, and is somewhat sensible, then it stops the process. The other problem is, let's say you nuke Kiev or you nuke Kramatorsk or any of these major locations. The wind can carry the radiation into Russia. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster had radiation carried all the way to Sweden, and cancer rates throughout the Soviet Union spiked after Chernobyl. And so Vladimir Putin would have to make the calculation that there's a decent chance that this wouldn't only affect the Ukrainians, this could affect the Russians and the entire international community. The international community also when it comes to nations like China and India, who, while not supporting the war, have basically been, taking a back step. They would eventually have to get involved. Because if that was normalized, India is going to be thinking about Pakistan, and China is going to be thinking of a possible nuclear confrontation with the United States over Taiwan. And I also want to say, if the international standard is set that you can invade a country, then just threaten a nuclear holocaust, and then you just get territory, that's going to lead to every regime on the planet who wants to invade another country to race to get nuclear weapons so they can just invade and say, I'll destroy the world if you don't let me take Ethiopia. I'll destroy the world if you don't let me get South Sudan back. I'll destroy the world if you don't give me Kashmir, right? And that is something that must be avoided. Lastly, we got to wrap up, but is there any personal stories that any of you would want to tell before we wrap up?
Something I wanted to speak about, but I went to hospitals all over. I met a young woman in Poltava. She was in the hospital from injury from shelling, and her father lives in Moscow. But when she called him to tell him that she was in the hospital because of Russian shelling, he didn't believe her. So there's this, side where like they're so caught up in the propaganda, and they're completely denying what's happening, even to their own family members. I have plenty of personal stories, but we don't have enough time for that. I'll let Tanya.
So I have several personal stories to share, and here I would like to say that I think that sharing such stuff, yet it is personal, I think that it just gives out a better perspective on what's going on across the whole country, because such stories as mine, they are not unique. So the first story is that when the war began, I was living in Kyiv for the last year, and I made the decision to flee. It wasn't the one that was easy for me, but I did it for my own safety, and I think that it was the right one, since in a couple of days, they bombed the neighborhood 10 minutes away from where I was living. But in a couple of days, my family, unfortunately, since 2014, when they were shooting next to Mariupol at Donbass, people started losing their sharp reaction on how things could be and whether this war can escalate, and in case if yes, then how exactly. So my family refused to flee, and on the 3rd of March, I lost the whole connection with them. And so did most of my friends. And the population of Mariupol was 400,000 of people before the war. And the only thing that you can do is that you can search up through Telegram channels, some local private, you can approximately understand which buildings and neighborhoods they were bombing in that day, and whether your own house was bombed or not. And someday I saw that there was a bomb near my house, and I saw that there are no glasses in windows, nothing. I didn't know whether my family was alive, because the first thing that they did, they hit all the infrastructure, including the connection, mobile connection, internet, everything. And I asked my friend who had a connection with his mother through Signal to get to my mom and to see whether she was alive. She was, but in a couple of days, that mother and the whole family of my friend, they were killed. And the only thing that was left from their bodies were skulls and teeth. Until those days, this person cannot find where exactly they were buried, whether it was a mass grave or not. And then in 10 days, they shelled the neighborhood again. And I see that they bombed my house, they shot it from tank, then they used aviation, and basically they're just ruins. There is nothing. And this is the time when I understand that yet we can say that we have the concept of what home is, that home is where your heart belongs, and etc. Now it's quite material, with your photographs, with your memories, with your family albums, whatever. And I did not know for another 1 month what was going on with my family and whether they stayed alive. And to be honest, I already didn't believe that I would see them again. But in a month, I got the message on WhatsApp from the unknown number, where it was said only one phrase: your mother is alive, and she gave me your phone number from just a piece of paper. Please contact her somehow. And for another 1 month, I did not have any contact with her. And only after that, I managed to meet her. I barely could recognize her after the blockade. In 1 more month, I found out that my grandfather, who is 90, who lived through the Holodomor, the starving thing, the Second World War, that he also lived through the blockade in Mariupol. And right now, luckily, my story has the happy end, because I have my family right now with me, but out of Ukraine. And they all have this PTSD thing, as the thing that you mentioned with planes, for example, because right now we live in Poland and near the airport, and I see their reactions, quite physical and quite sharp. But I have to say that, yet my story is lucky. It doesn't mean that it was same lucky for other people. Several days ago, my relative died. He was in the army. He was only 28, and I believe that he could do so many great things. And since the number of victims in Mariupol, 100,000 of people, this is only one city, but they're shelling constantly, daily, across the whole country, and one can never know when the life can end. You understand how much fragile it is. And this is the reason why I do think that it is important to share these stories, and it's also important, as much as maybe cliche these days it sounds, to stand with Ukraine, because you never know when the war can knock your doors before it comes.
I'm going to wrap this up with a story I want to communicate, and it was asked by me by somebody to communicate this story, so I feel like it's my responsibility. I met a wonderful woman by the name of Anna in the city of Kharkiv. I'll say Anna because I can't pronounce her full name because I'm, again, an American. And I went to Kharkiv. She welcomed me into her home so I could film in the city. I filmed the targeting of the electrical grid. I filmed a lot of stuff there. But the main reason I was there was because of her. I wanted to interview her about an experience she had. And I was gonna interview her no matter what, because she was an amazing person who participated in Euromaidan, has put her life on the line multiple times to try to help other people. But during the process of me setting up the trip to her location, her father, who was a gardener, loved cats that he would feed out on the porch, was on the porch one day in Kharkiv, and he was feeding a cat that regularly came up and visited him. It was a street cat, which there are many of in Ukraine. And while sitting on the porch, his wife comes out, her mother comes out and tries to come inside, air sirens, air sirens. He's like, the whole, hardened, like, I'm a man, this is my home, I'll do what I want. Wife goes back in the home, and a Russian artillery shell tears through the porch, tearing him to shreds. He was killed instantly. He was ripped to shreds. His intestines were about to spill off of the porch that was elevated. He was completely obliterated. It was a very brutal image. This shakes the whole home, and the wife comes out so shaken that she starts grabbing his ankle, trying to wake him up, even though he was already dead. And I interviewed her about the death of her father, and they were such loving people that they gave me this little keepsake to keep me safe from something like that happening to me. I go to them to interview them about their family tragedy, and they think ahead to make me a little keepsake to keep me safe. And that is the spirit of the Ukrainian people that has suffered through this war, but will persevere through this war. It is brutal, it is terrible, and for every war crime that happens, that is documented on mainstream media and that there is a picture of, there are 10 more that get covered up by the Russian army or don't get covered in mainstream media. And I just wanted to emphasize that to you guys. The same thing is true of the Yugoslav civil wars and Yugoslav genocides and of the Second World War as well. And just remember that for every war crime you hear about, there are 10 more that happen that'll never grace your ears. Yeah. Thank you.